The wind carried dust across the plains that day, but the sound of children's sobs cut sharper than the biting air. In the dim glow of the sinking sun, an Apache woman lay on the ground, clutching her side where bones had cracked under the violence of settlers. Every breath rattled inside her chest as if it might be her last. Her face, once strong and proud, was pale with pain. Beside her, 2 children clung to her torn dress, their voices breaking in cries that were far too old for their years. They were not weeping over a scraped knee or a missed meal. They were begging for their mother's life. "Please," the eldest whispered to a man standing in the doorway of a nearby cabin. His voice trembled, but there was a sharpness in it too, the kind of tone a child should never need to find. "Settlers broke Mama's ribs. Can she rest in your cabin?" The words hung heavy in the cold air, echoing across the clearing. The boy's eyes glistened with tears, his face smudged with dirt from the trail. He pulled his younger sister close, who buried her head in his chest. Too afraid to look at the settler dot behind them, their father stood frozen, watching. A single Apache, his long braids dusty, his clothing torn from weeks of hardship, he bore no weapon now. The warrior who had once hunted, fought, and protected was reduced to silence. His hands trembled at his sides. His face was a mask of grief and helplessness. And then it came tears. They slipped down his cheeks unbidden. He wept openly, though warriors of his people were taught never to show weakness. But this was not weakness. This was the breaking of a spirit. His wife lay dying. His children begged strangers for mercy, and he could do nothing but watch. The settler in the doorway shifted uneasily, lantern light flickering behind him. He looked at the family, an injured woman gasping for breath, children pleading for her, and a man whose sorrow made the earth itself feel heavier. But instead of opening his door, he let the silence grow. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his hand gripped the frame of the cabin tightly, as if shelter itself was a possession too precious to share. The children didn't understand this silence. They only knew their mother's chest rose slower and her skin grew colder. Their voices rose louder, desperate. "She can't breathe right. She just needs a place to lie down. Please, mister." Still, the door remained closed. The father turned his face away, ashamed to let his children see his tears, ashamed of his own powerlessness. He had fought battles before against rival tribes, against hunger, against storms, but this was a battle against cruelty, and cruelty was winning. He knelt beside his wife, cradling her head gently, whispering words in Apache too soft for the children to hear. His tears fell onto her hair, dark against the dust. To anyone watching, the scene would have looked like a painting, the cabin's sharp lines silhouetted in the fading light, the settler's figure in the doorway cast half in shadow, the Apache family huddled together in the dirt. But it was not art, it was suffering. It was history playing out in the silence between plea and denial. The boy's words, simple as they were, had more weight than gunshots. "Settlers broke Mama's ribs. Can she rest in your cabin?" It was not just a question. It was an accusation, a confession, and a cry for humanity all at once. It was a child putting into words what his father could not, that they were not enemies. They were not invaders. They were human beings, broken and begging for compassion. But no hand reached out. No door swung open. Only the sound of the mother's shallow breathing, the children's sobs, and the father's quiet weeping filled the night. And in that moment, under the endless sky of the plains, history itself tilted. Because while battles and treaties would one day be written in books, it was these unseen moments, these tears in the dirt, that carried the true weight of conquest. The boy stood straighter than a child his age should ever have to. His shoulders were small, his knees still shaky from days without enough food, but his eyes carried the weight of a man. He clutched his sister's hand so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The little girl leaned into him, her breath ragged with fear, but she let him speak for both of them. "Please, sir," the boy tried again, voice thin but steady. "She's hurt bad. Mama can't walk no more." "Just a roof?" "Just one night." His words fell into the cold evening air like stones into a well disappearing into silence, swallowed by the emptiness. The settler shifted again, the flicker of the lantern behind him casting shadows that made his face hard to read. He wasn't a cruel-looking man, not in the way of snarling villains. His features were plain, weathered by work and wind. Yet his eyes betrayed calculation, the guarded hesitation of someone unwilling to see the humanity before him. The girl, sensing her brother's plea slipping away, broke free of his hand. She stumbled forward on bare, dusty feet and grabbed at the hem of the settler's coat. Her small fingers clutched the rough fabric, trembling. "Please, mister," she whispered, tears streaking the dirt on her cheeks. "She just needs a bed. She can't breathe." Her words came out with the unpolished honesty only a child could summon. No anger, no bargaining. Just raw, desperate truth. Behind them, the Apache father's chest tightened. He had taught his son to be strong, to hunt rabbits with a bow, to remember the songs of their ancestors. He had cradled his daughter when she was born, promising her a life of warmth and laughter. Now both his children were reduced to beggars, reaching out to the very people who had broken their mother's body. He wanted to speak, to roar like thunder and make the earth itself shake with his fury, but what power did a man have when his wife was dying and his children's survival hinged on a stranger's mercy? The boy tugged at his sister's arm, trying to pull her back, but she clung tighter to the settler's coat. "We'll be quiet," she promised, her voice shaking. "We won't break nothing. Just let Mama rest, please." The settler looked down at her. His lips parted as though words might finally come, but none did. His jaw tightened. His hand twitched against the doorframe. Somewhere behind him, a woman's voice called from inside the cabin dinner, perhaps, or some small domestic comfort that made his home feel safe and ordered. The kind of comfort that the Apache family had lost the day soldiers and settlers swept across their lands. The sound of that woman's voice seemed to harden him. He reached down slowly, not to lift the girl to safety, not to offer comfort, but to pry her tiny hand from his coat. One finger at a time, he loosened her grip, until her hands fell empty to her sides. The girl staggered backward, her lip trembling. She looked first at her brother, then at her father, and finally back at the settler. "Please," she whispered again, so soft it was almost a prayer. But the man did not bend. His silence became its own weapon, sharper than steel, colder than gunfire. The door between them was not just wood. It was a barrier of fear, prejudice, and greed. The boy's face hardened. He wrapped his arm around his sister and pulled her away from the cabin. His voice rose louder now, breaking with emotion. "We're not asking for food. We're not asking for money. Just let her breathe inside your house one night." For a moment, his voice echoed across the clearing, carried by the wind as if the land itself was listening. But still the settler gave no answer. Behind them, the Apache father's tears slipped quietly into the dust. He could not bring himself to move, to intervene. This was not a fight of weapons, but of mercy. And mercy was something he no longer knew how to demand. The children stood in the fading light, their words hanging unanswered in the air. Their small voices pitted against the silence of a man who had already decided they did not belong. And so, the plea remained just that a cry thrown into the vast night sky, unheard by the only one who could have changed its ending. The cabin door was open just wide enough for the lantern light to spill out, a warm glow against the night. Inside, shadows flickered over shelves of dried goods, a sturdy table, and the comforting order of a settler's home. To the Apache family crouched in the dirt, it looked like another world, a world of warmth and safety, separated from them by a single wooden threshold. The settler filled that threshold. His broad shoulders blocked the light, his silhouette sharp against the golden glow. He was a man who had endured his own hardships, who had staked his claim on this land with sweat and stubbornness. Yet whatever struggles he carried had calcified into suspicion. His eyes narrowed, not with cruelty exactly, but with something colder, the refusal to see. The boy's plea still hung in the air. Just one night. Just a bed. His sister's hand still tingled from being pulled away from the settler's coat. But the man only stood there, silent, finally. He shook his head, slowly. Deliberately. It was not an angry gesture, nor one of pity. It was the motion of a door closing long before the wood had swung shut. His lips pressed together in a line, thin as a blade. Then, with the smallest motion of his arm, he drew the door closer to him. The hinges groaned. The boy's eyes widened. "No, please, wait." His voice cracked with desperation, but the settler said nothing. Behind the door, the faint voice of a woman called again. "Henry?" It was a domestic tone, curious but untroubled, the kind of sound that carried all the weight of normal life. She might have been setting bread on the table or rocking a baby to sleep, unaware of the family outside gasping for mercy. Henry the settler hesitated only long enough to call back, "Nothing. Just coyotes." Coyotes. The word struck the Apache father like a blow. Coyotes were scavengers, pests, unwanted creatures prowling near human homes. To Henry, that was what they were now, not a man, not a woman, not children, but animals scratching at his door. The Apache man's breath shuddered in his chest. His tears slowed, replaced by a hollow ache. The boy heard the word too, and his face twisted, not just with sorrow now, but with something harder. Something that might one day grow into rage. The girl, too young to understand insult, only clutched at her brother again. "We're not coyotes," she whispered into his chest, though she wasn't sure if she believed it anymore. The door creaked again, swinging closer to its frame. The golden light narrowed into a sliver. The children's shadows stretched longer in the dust, pulled toward the shrinking gap of warmth. Double quote, "Sir, please?" The boy shouted, his voice breaking. "She's dying!" But Henry's face did not soften. His eyes, set deep under his brow, carried the weariness of a man who had built walls not just from logs and clay, but from fear. Fear of the unfamiliar. Fear of the people whose land this once was. Fear that kindness would be seen as weakness. The door thudded shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot across the clearing. The lantern light vanished. The family was left in darkness. For a moment, no one moved. The children stared at the door, waiting for it to open again, hoping the man would return, that his heart might shift in those next few seconds. But the silence from within was final. The only sound was the muffled clatter of dishes and the soft laughter of people inside people, who would eat and sleep in comfort while, just outside, another family fought for survival. The boy's fists clenched. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, as if he were trying to hold back a scream. His sister buried her face in his shirt, sobbing so quietly it was almost a whimper. Behind them, the Apache father closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged. He had seen many doors close in his lifetime. The door of his people's land, the door of peace with the settlers, the door of trust in men who promised treaties. But this door, the door to a cabin where his wife might have found a single night's mercy, this was the heaviest. He whispered a word in his tongue, a word the children barely understood. It meant finished. Not finished like an ending, but finished like a hope extinguished. The coldness of the settler's refusal was not loud, not violent. It did not strike with a weapon or spill blood in the dirt. But it was just as deadly, It was the kind of coldness that kills slowly, leaving the wounded to fade in the dark. And so, while laughter rose inside the cabin, outside the Apache family sank into silence, wrapped not in blankets of warmth, but in the bitter chill of rejection. The night grew still after the cabin door closed, its echo fading into a silence heavier than stone. The laughter and clatter from inside drifted faintly into the air, but to the Apache father it might as well have come from another world. He remained kneeling in the dust, one knee pressed into the cold earth, his head bowed, his hands trembling in the dim light of the moon. He had been raised to believe a warrior should stand tall, even when surrounded by enemies, even when wounded. A warrior's tears were meant for the unseen world, for the spirits of ancestors, not for the living. His father had told him as a boy, "Hold your grief inside. Crying makes your enemy stronger." And yet, there he was, tears sliding silently down his face, catching in the ridges of his cheeks, falling onto the dirt where the land itself seemed to drink them in. His shoulders shook despite his effort to still them. His mouth pressed tight as though he might hold the sound back, but the sobs came anyway, deep in his chest, silent and terrible that his children noticed. The boy turned toward him, startled, as if seeing something forbidden. His father, the one who had taught him to notch arrows, to skin rabbits, to ride the wind across the plains, was weeping like a broken child. It frightened him more than the settler's rejection. If his father could break, what hope was left? The girl crept toward her father, crawling on her knees across the dust. She pressed her tiny hand to his arm, her touch as light as a feather. "Papa," she whispered, "don't cry." Her words were tender, but they carried a sting. She did not yet understand that sometimes tears are the only weapon a man has when the world refuses him everything else. The father lifted his hand to her hair, smoothing it gently. His lips parted, but no words came. He wanted to tell her he cried not out of weakness, but because his heart was too full, too heavy. He wanted to say he wept for her mother's broken body, for the humiliation of begging at a settler's door, for the cruel word coyotes that had stripped their dignity. But language failed him. His grief lived in his chest, too vast to be spoken. He turned his gaze skyward, to the stars that glittered like ancient eyes watching. His people believed the stars were the campfires of ancestors, burning in the sky to remind them they were never alone. But tonight, the stars felt distant, indifferent, as if even the ancestors had turned their backs. Another sob shook him, this one rougher, breaking past his lips. He pressed his forehead into the earth, hiding his face. His braids fell across his shoulders like black rivers in the moonlight. His tears darkened the soil beneath him, marking the ground with his sorrow. The boy's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout at his father, to demand he stop, because every tear felt like a surrender. But at the same time, he wanted to fall into his arms and cry with him, to let go of the weight pressing against his chest. He stayed frozen, torn between wanting to be strong and wanting to be a child. The girl nestled against her father, wrapping both arms around him, though her body was too small to offer much comfort. Still, he held her as though she were a shield. She murmured softly into his chest, "It's okay, Papa. We'll find another place. Mama will be okay." Her innocence was both a balm and a knife. She didn't see how grave her mother's condition was, how shallow each breath had become. The father's tears slowed, but his silence deepened. His face was carved with pain, his body trembling less now, but his spirit felt hollow. For a long while he said nothing, letting the wind carry the cries of coyotes and the distance real ones calling to each other in the night. The irony cut deep. To the settler, they were no different from those scavengers, creatures to be pushed away, despised, denied. But to him, his family was sacred. His wife was sacred. His children were sacred. And yet, The world had stripped that truth from them as easily as shutting a door. Finally, he whispered a word so soft it was almost lost to the night. It was the name of his wife. His voice cracked as it left him, a prayer and a farewell tangled together. Then he closed his eyes and let the silence return, his tears seeping into the earth like offerings the spirits might one day remember. The children huddled close, unsure of what to say, clinging to him as though their warmth might stitch his spirit back together. But the warrior sat unmoving, broken not by bullets or blades, but by a door that refused to open, and the prairie, vast and indifferent, carried his silent weeping into the night. The father sat in the dust, his arms wrapped around his children, his heart heavy with sorrow. Yet as the night air pressed colder against them, his mind slipped back to a time before broken ribs and closed doors. When the world felt whole, he remembered the river first. The Gila River had sung through their homeland, its waters sparkling beneath the sun. His wife had laughed there, kneeling on smooth stones as she rinsed a basket. Her hair had fallen loose down her back, glistening with droplets that caught the light. She looked up at him that day with a smile that needed no words, her dark eyes filled with warmth. Their children had been smaller then, both barely walking. They played near the shore, giggling as they splashed the shallow water with tiny hands. The boy had carried a stick as if it were a spear, already mimicking his father, shouting proudly, "I will hunt the deer." The girl had waddled after him, her laughter bubbling like the river itself. The father's heart had swelled that day. He remembered crouching low, showing his son how to watch the water, how to notice the way fish moved beneath the ripples. He remembered lifting his daughter high into the air, her delighted squeal echoing across the canyon. The air had smelled of sage and sweet grass, and the world had seemed endless and kind. In the evenings they gathered around a fire. His wife would sing, her voice soft but steady, carrying the old songs her mother had taught her. The children would sway to the rhythm, sometimes clapping out of tune, sometimes falling asleep curled against their parents. The father would tell stories of Coyote the Trickster, of how the stars were placed in the sky, of how bravery meant not only fighting but also protecting. His son would listen with wide eyes, absorbing every word, while his daughter's head would nod in sleep against her mother's shoulder. Food was never plentiful, but it was shared. When a deer was caught, the family celebrated with neighbors. When berries ripened, the children ran through the brush with sticky fingers and smiling mouths. No door was ever closed. No one was ever called a scavenger. The father remembered one moment especially. A storm had rolled across the horizon, lightning splitting the sky. Instead of fear, the children had run outside, their arms wide, their voices lifted in laughter as the rain soaked them through. His wife had chased after them, pretending to scold, though she laughed too, her dress clinging to her as she spun in the rain. He had stood back, watching them all, struck by how beautiful his world was. His heart had whispered then, "This is everything. This is enough." That memory cut him now, sharper than any blade, because that world was gone. The river banks had been trampled by wagons. The deer were driven away by settlers' cattle. The neighbors who once shared food were scattered, forced from their homes. And the laughter of his wife, the sound that had once carried him through hunger and hardship, was replaced now by her labored breaths, each one weaker than the last. The children, too, had changed. His son's eyes no longer carried the boundless curiosity of a boy by the river. They were older now, hardening, learning lessons no child should have to learn: what it felt like to beg, what it felt like to be refused. His daughter still clung to innocence, still believed in comfort and kindness, but the settler's rejection had planted a seed of doubt that would one day grow into understanding. He bowed his head lower. The contrast was too cruel. To remember her laughter by the river while hearing her faint gasps in the dust, it was unbearable. to remember his children's carefree play while watching them. Tremble in fear, it was like carrying two worlds at once, one warm and alive, one cold and dying. The prairie wind rustled through the dry grass, whispering as though it carried echoes of the past. He could almost hear his wife's song again, faint and fragile. He could almost hear his children's giggles. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the memory hold him, because it was the only place left where his family was whole. Then his wife's real breath rattled beside him, thin and strained, dragging him back into the present. He opened his eyes, and the warmth of the river faded like smoke. What remained was dust, darkness, and the cruel reality of a world that had stolen everything from them. The memory was a gift and a wound. It reminded him of what he had once held and what he was about to lose. The father sat in the dust, his arms wrapped around his children, his heart heavy with sorrow. Yet as the night air pressed colder against them, his mind slipped back to a time before broken ribs and closed doors. When the world felt whole, he remembered the river first. The Gila River had sung through their homeland, its waters sparkling beneath the sun. His wife had laughed there, kneeling on smooth stones as she rinsed a basket. Her hair had fallen loose down her back, glistening with droplets that caught the light. She looked up at him that day with a smile that needed no words, her dark eyes filled with warmth. Their children had been smaller then, both barely walking. They played near the shore, giggling as they splashed the shallow water with tiny hands. The boy had carried a stick as if it were a spear, already mimicking his father, shouting proudly, "I will hunt the deer." The girl had waddled after him, her laughter bubbling like the river itself. The father's heart had swelled that day. He remembered crouching low, showing his son how to watch the water, how to notice the way fish moved beneath the ripples. He remembered lifting his daughter high into the air, her delighted squeal echoing across the canyon. The air had smelled of sage and sweet grass, and the world had seemed endless and kind. In the evenings, they gathered around a fire. His wife would sing, her voice soft but steady, carrying the old songs her mother had taught her. The children would sway to the rhythm, sometimes clapping out of tune, sometimes falling asleep curled against their parents. The father would tell stories of Coyote the Trickster, of how the stars were placed in the sky, of how bravery meant not only fighting but also protecting. His son would listen with wide eyes, absorbing every word, while his daughter's head would nod in sleep against her mother's shoulder. Food was never plentiful, but it was shared. When a deer was caught, the family celebrated with neighbors. When berries ripened, the children ran through the brush with sticky fingers and smiling mouths. No door was ever closed. No one was ever called a scavenger. The father remembered one moment especially. A storm had rolled across the horizon, lightning splitting the sky. Instead of fear, the children had run outside, their arms wide, their voices lifted in laughter as the rain soaked them through. His wife had chased after them, pretending to scold, though she laughed too, her dress clinging to her as she spun in the rain. He had stood back, watching them all, struck by how beautiful his world was. His heart had whispered then, "This is everything. This is enough." That memory cut him now, sharper than any blade, because that world was gone. The river banks had been trampled by wagons. The deer were driven away by settlers' cattle. The neighbors who once shared food were scattered, forced from their homes. And the laughter of his wife, the sound that had once carried him through hunger and hardship, was replaced now by her labored breaths, each one weaker than the last. The children, too, had changed. His son's eyes no longer carried the boundless curiosity of a boy by the river. They were older now, hardening, learning lessons no child should have to learn: what it felt like to beg, what it felt like to be refused. His daughter still clung to innocence, still believed in comfort and kindness, but the settler's rejection had planted a seed of doubt that would one Day grow into understanding. He bowed his head lower. The contrast was too cruel. To remember her laughter by the river while hearing her faint gasps in the dust, it was unbearable. To remember his children's carefree play while watching them tremble in fear, it was like carrying two worlds at once, one warm and alive, one cold and dying. The prairie wind rustled through the dry grass, whispering as though it carried echoes of the past. He could almost hear his wife's song again, faint and fragile. He could almost hear his children's giggles. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the memory hold him, because it was the only place left where his family was whole. Then his wife's real breath rattled beside him, thin and strained, dragging him back into the present. He opened his eyes, and the warmth of the river faded like smoke. What remained was dust, darkness, and the cruel reality of a world that had stolen everything from them. The memory was a gift and a wound. It reminded him of what he had once held and what he was about to lose. The prairie dawn came slowly, painting the horizon with streaks of pale gold and muted rose. The long grasses shivered under the touch of morning wind, and the stars faded one by one, their campfires extinguished in the sky. But for the Apache family, the new day brought no warmth. The children stirred beside their mother, their small bodies curled against her as they had through the long, bitter night. The boy blinked awake first, squinting against the light that crept across the plains. His sister still slept, her face pressed into their mother's dress. For a moment, in the fragile haze between dreaming and waking, it felt almost like another morning by the river, another day where their mother would smile and sing them awake. But then he noticed the stillness. Her chest no longer rose. Her hand, which he had held through the night, was cold and stiff beneath his fingers. Her face, once alive with laughter and song, was pale in the dawn, her lips tinged with the color of ash. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He shook her gently. "Mama." His voice was small, trembling. He shook her harder. "Mama." "Wake up." The girl stirred at the sound, yawning softly before lifting her head. She rubbed her eyes, blinking at her brother. Then she looked down at their mother, and her sleepy smile froze. "Mama?" she whispered. She laid her ear against her chest, waiting for the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Nothing. She pressed harder, desperate. Still nothing. Panic lit her eyes. "She's not breathing," she cried, clutching at her mother's dress. "Mama, wake up." Her voice cracked into sobs, raw and desperate. The boy pulled her back, tears already burning down his cheeks. "She's gone," he choked, though the words tore at him like knives. He didn't want to believe them, didn't want to say them. But the truth weighed on him like the sky itself pressing down. The girl shook her head furiously, pounding her tiny fists against her mother's chest as though she could knock life back into it. "No, no. She promised she'd sing." Her cries grew louder, frantic, filling the quiet morning. The father had not slept. He had held his wife's hand until the night took her, and even after, he could not release it. When the children's cries pierced the air, he finally stirred. His face was hollow, his eyes red and sunken, but his body moved with a strength drawn from grief. He gathered the children to him, pulling them into his arms, even as they fought to cling to their mother. His embrace was firm, steady, a wall against the storm of their sorrow. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. "The spirits have taken her." The girl screamed into his chest, shaking her head. The boy clung silently, his tears soaking his father's shoulder. For the first time, he did not try to be strong. He let himself collapse into his father's arms, a child again, vulnerable and undone. The father rocked them gently, his own tears spilling freely now, unchecked. He pressed his face into his wife's hair one last time, inhaling the faint scent of smoke and sage that lingered there. Clinging to memory. Then, when the children's sobs quieted into hiccups. The father lifted his head to the sky. The cry that tore from his chest was like nothing human. It was a sound of rage and despair, of love ripped away, of centuries of loss condensed into one raw, uncontainable howl. It rose into the dawn, echoing across the plains, startling the birds from the grass. The coyotes answered in the distance, their own cries mingling with his. A chorus of grief carried on the wind. The boy buried his face against his father's chest, trembling. The girl covered her ears, unable to bear the sound, yet somehow knowing it was the only way her father could survive this moment. The cabin stood silent in the distance, its windows dark. No one came to the door. No one acknowledged the cry that split the morning open, but the land heard. The earth beneath them seemed to hold the father's sorrow, drinking in his tears as it had in the night. The prairie grasses bent low in the wind, bowing as though they too mourned. When his voice finally broke, when the howl dissolved into ragged silence, the father bowed over his wife's still body. His hand rested on her chest, not to wake her, but to honor her. The children clung to his sides, their faces pressed into his arms. The dawn had come, but for them it brought no new beginning. It brought only silence, the silence of a mother's absence, the silence of a door still closed, the silence of a family broken beneath the weight of cruelty, and in that silence the world moved on, indifferent. But for the Apache family, the day would forever be marked as the morning the prairie heard what men refused to hear. The sun had fully risen now, a pale gold disk climbing into a cloudless sky. The light touched the prairie with indifference, spilling across the grasses, across the settler's cabin, across the still form of the woman who would never rise again. The Apache father knelt beside her for a long time. His shadow stretched across her body. His tears had slowed, but his heart felt hollow, a cavern echoing with her voice that was no longer there. He smoothed her hair one final time, braiding a single strand as he had done so many evenings before when they sat together by the fire. He placed his hand over her heart, whispering her name into the morning wind. Then, with trembling arms, he lifted his children. The boy clung to his shoulder, his face buried against his father's neck, hiding his tears as though ashamed of them. The girl rested in his other arm, her small hand still clutching the edge of her mother's dress, refusing to let go even as it dragged in the dust. Neither child spoke. Their sobs had quieted into hiccuping breaths, the kind that linger after grief has wrung the body dry. The father stood, his knees unsteady but unbroken. He looked once more at the cabin, its door closed, its windows still dark. For a moment, he imagined storming it, shattering the wood, dragging the settler out, demanding that he feel the weight of what his silence had caused. But no, vengeance would not bring his wife back. It would not soothe the cries of his children, so he turned his back to it, and began to walk. Each step was heavy, sinking into the earth as though the land itself wanted to hold him there. But he pressed forward, carrying his children against the weight of sorrow. Their small bodies clung to him, making him both weaker and stronger at once. The prairie stretched endless before them, a horizon that promised nothing and everything. There was no cabin waiting for them out there, no warm fire, no safety. Yet the father walked anyway, because to stop was to surrender, and surrender was the one thing he could not give. The boy lifted his head after a while, looking out over the endless grass. His voice was faint, cracked with grief. "Where are we going, Papa?" The father's throat tightened. He wanted to say home, but that word had been stolen. He wanted to say to family, but their family was already broken. So he said nothing. He only shifted his son higher against his shoulder and kept walking. The girl's whisper came next, soft against his ear. "Mama will find us, won't she?" The father closed his eyes briefly, letting the ache stab through him like a knife. He kissed her hair. She already walks with us, he murmured. It was the only truth he could offer. Behind them. The prairie was marked with the trail of their passing, footprints in the dust, a dress dragging in the dirt, and the still body of the woman who had given them life. No one would mark the spot. No settler would record it in his journal. No monument would rise. Only the land would remember. And yet, perhaps that was enough. The father's mind whispered words he could not say aloud. History will remember the conquerors, their forts, their cabins, their victories. But the prairie remembers us. The wind remembers our songs. The earth remembers our tears. He paused once more on a ridge, looking back at the cabin. The sunlight glared off its windows, making it seem like nothing more than a box of wood, small and ugly against the vastness of the land. He spat into the dust, then turned away forever. The horizon stretched wide and merciless, but also infinite. With every step forward, his figure grew smaller against it, a single man carrying the last of his family. Yet in that image his broad back bent beneath sorrow, his arms strong despite their weight, there was something eternal. Not victory, not peace, but survival. And survival, even stripped to its bones, was defiance. As the prairie wind rose again, it seemed to carry voices, her laughter by the river, the children's giggles, the songs of ancestors. The father walked into it, his tears drying against the wind, his face set toward the horizon. The world would forget his name, but it would never erase his walk, nor the cries of his children, nor the silence of a door that would not open, because history remembers the conquerors. But the land, the stars, and the wind, they remember the tears of the conquered.